The morning of departure arrived with a pale sun rising over the Therian landscape. And Yesio sat in her hover chair at the entrance of her father's estate, watching servants load her few personal belongings onto the human transport vessel. She had lived in this place her entire life. And yet she felt no grief at leaving. The walls that had sheltered her had also imprisoned her, and the halls that should have echoed with family warmth had only ever held silence and shame. A servant approached and informed her that Baron Keshen wished to speak with her one final time before she left. Iasio considered refusing, but something made her agree to the meeting. Perhaps she needed one last moment of closure before stepping into her new life. Her father waited in his private study, surrounded by the trophies and treasures he had accumulated over decades of ruthless commerce. He looked smaller than she remembered, as if the previous day's defeat had drained something essential from his towering presence. "You do not have to do this," the Baron said, and his voice was softer than Yesio had ever heard it. "I know I have not been the father you deserved, but we can start again." He moved closer and placed a hand on the arm of her hover chair in what might have been a gesture of affection. "Stay here where you belong, and I will support your research properly this time. I will give you everything you need." For a moment, Yesio felt the old pull of hope that had never quite died despite years of neglect and cruelty. This was what she had wanted for so long. Her father's recognition and acceptance. But then she looked into his eyes and saw the truth hiding behind his gentle words. He was not offering love or support. He was offering a cage with softer bars. "You had 20 years to see me," Yesio said quietly. 20 years to notice that your daughter had a mind worth nurturing. 20 years to show even the smallest sign that I mattered to you. She pulled her hover chair back from his reaching hand. "It took a stranger one evening to see what you refused to acknowledge my entire life. And you only speak these words now because my work has value to you, not because I do." Baron Keshen's face flickered through several expressions before settling on cold anger. "You will regret this," he said. "The humans will use you until your usefulness is spent, and then they will discard you just as I warned." Yesio shook her head slowly. "Perhaps they will," she said, "but at least they gave me the chance to find out, which is more than you ever did." She turned her hover chair and left the study without looking back, and the sound of the door closing behind her felt like the breaking of chains she had worn so long she had forgotten they existed. Hyun was waiting for her at the transport vessel, and he said nothing as she approached, but simply fell into step beside her hover chair. As they boarded together, the ship lifted off smoothly, and through the viewing window, Yesio watched her homeworld grow smaller until it was just another point of light among millions. "Are you all right?" Do-hyun asked after a long silence. "I do not know," Yesio admitted. "I feel as though I am waking up from a dream that lasted my entire life, and I am not sure what the waking world looks like." Do-hyun nodded as if he understood perfectly. "It looks like whatever you want it to look like," he said. "That is the terrifying and wonderful thing about freedom." The journey to human space took several days, and Yesio spent most of that time in the ship's small laboratory speaking with Dr. Yoon and the other scientists aboard. They asked her questions about her theoretical work with genuine interest and challenged her conclusions. With respectful rigor, no one commented on her hover chair or treated her as though her physical limitations defined her worth. It was disorienting and beautiful, and sometimes overwhelming. On the third day of the journey, she found Do-hyun sitting alone in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. She guided her hover chair beside him and joined his silent contemplation. "Can I ask you something?" she finally said. "Of course. Why did you come over?" "To me that night, truly. Was it just to spite my father?" Do-hyun was quiet for a moment before answering. "When I was young, there was a girl in my village who had been in an accident that left her unable to walk," he said. Everyone treated her as though her life was over, as though she had nothing left to offer. But she became a writer who told stories that made people laugh and cry and think about the world in new ways. He turned to look at Yezio directly. She taught me that the body is just a vessel, and what matters is the fire that burns inside it. When I saw you sitting alone with that tablet in your lap, I recognized the same fire in you. You saw all that in one glance. Yezio asked skeptically. I saw someone who refused to stop working despite being told she was worthless. Doyen replied, That is not weakness. That is the most human trait I know. Yezio smiled despite herself. I'm not human. She pointed out. Doyen grinned back at her. Maybe not. But you have the spirit. 6 months later, the Galactic Cartography Institute held its annual conference on the neutral station of Harmony. Prime scientists and researchers from 100 different species gathered to present their work and share discoveries that would shape the future of interstellar civilization. In the grand auditorium, a hover chair moved onto the stage carrying a young Therian woman whose name had become famous across the galaxy. Yezio faced the assembled crowd with calm confidence and began presenting the research that would reshape FTL travel for generations. To come, her voice was steady and her explanations were clear. And when she finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very walls in the audience. Don sat quietly and watched the woman he had recognized in a lonely corner transform into a star that blazed for everyone to see. He did not cheer or call attention to himself, because this moment belonged entirely to her across the galaxy. Baron Voreth Keshen watched the broadcast from his estate, which had grown considerably smaller after the scandal destroyed his business partnerships and political connections. He saw his daughter standing in glory and recognition, and he understood at last what he had thrown away with his own cruelty and blindness. Yezio caught sight of the camera as she concluded her presentation, and for just a moment her eyes seemed to look directly at those watching from afar. She did not smile with triumph or satisfaction. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the journey that had brought her here, and then turned to embrace her new colleagues who crowded the stage to congratulate her. The broken girl had become whole. The invisible one had been seen, and the human who had started it all simply slipped away into the crowd, his work complete, ready to find the next hidden light waiting to shine. Baron Voreth Keshen entered his private conference chamber with the confidence of a predator who had already claimed victory. The negotiations had gone exactly as he planned, and the human delegation had agreed to terms that heavily favored Therian interests. All that remained was the formal signing, and then these primitive newcomers would return to their little world with whatever scraps he had chosen to give them. He glanced at his daughter Yezio, who sat in her hover chair near the corner of the room, and felt the familiar wave of disgust that always accompanied her presence. The humans had requested that she attend this meeting, some foolish gesture of sentimentality that the Baron had agreed to simply because it cost him nothing. Let them pretend to care about the broken girl if it made them feel noble. Ambassador Minji Cho entered the chamber with her delegation following close behind, and Baron Keshen noted with satisfaction that the human soldier from the previous night was among them. Good, he thought. Let him watch as his species accepts their inferior position. But something in the ambassador's bearing made the Baron pause. She did not carry herself like someone preparing to accept defeat. She walked with purpose and power, and her eyes held a sharpness that had not been there before. Baron Keshen, Ambassador Cho said formally, thank you for hosting this final meeting. Before we proceed with the signing ceremony, there is a matter of great importance that we must discuss. What matter could possibly be more important than concluding our successful negotiations? The Baron asked with a dismissive wave of his jeweled hand. "This matter," the ambassador replied. She gestured to Dr. Yoon, who stepped forward and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with complex equations and star charts. The Therian officials who had gathered to witness the signing leaned forward with confusion, and even Baron Keshin felt his attention drawn to the unfamiliar symbols floating in the air. "What is this?" he demanded. "This is a revolutionary theoretical model for FTL transit optimization," Dr. Yoon announced. "A model that could reduce fuel consumption across all standard routes by nearly 40%. Murmurs rippled through the assembled Therians, and several scientists among them began studying the equations with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary," one of them said. "The mathematical framework is entirely original." "Who developed this?" another asked with obvious hunger in his voice. Ambassador Cho turned to face Baron Keshin directly. "The creator of this work is present in this room," she said. "It was developed by Yesio over the course of 7 years while she resided in your estate." Every eye in the chamber turned toward the young woman in the hover chair, and Baron Keshin felt his blood turn to ice. "That is impossible," he said quickly. "She has no training, no resources. She spends her days playing with numbers to pass the time. The simulations do not lie," Dr. Yoon replied firmly. "This work has been verified by our scientific team, and I am prepared to testify to its authenticity before any academic body in the galaxy." Baron Keshin's mind raced as he tried to understand how this could have happened under his own roof. Without his knowledge, he looked at Yesio, who sat with her, hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor. And for the first time he saw not a burden to be hidden, but a threat to be contained, regardless of who created this work. He said with forced calm, "It was developed using resources belonging to my household, and under Therian law, any intellectual property produced by a dependent belongs to the head of the family." He straightened his robes and allowed a cold smile to spread across his face. "I thank the human delegation for bringing this discovery to my attention, and I will ensure that it receives proper development through appropriate Therian channels." The Baron expected the humans to deflate with disappointment, but instead Ambassador Cho simply nodded as if she had anticipated this response. "I thought you might say that," she said, "which is why I took the liberty of researching Therian inheritance and dependency law before this meeting." She produced a small device and activated a recording that filled the room with the Baron's own voice from the previous night. "Since humans are so famous for their charity, perhaps our sergeant would like to keep my broken daughter company for the evening, since neither of them truly belongs among the worthy." The recording ended, and Baron Keshin felt something cold settle in his stomach. According to Section 47 of the Therian Dependency Code, Ambassador Cho continued, "A family head may exercise authority over a dependent's property and labor, only so long as that dependent remains recognized as a member of the family in good standing." She paused and let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "However, Section 48 clearly states that any public declaration of unworthiness made before witnesses constitutes a legal severance of familial bonds, releasing the dependent from all obligations and claims of authority." The Baron's face had gone pale beneath his blue-gray skin. "You cannot be serious. The recording speaks for itself," Ambassador Cho replied. "You declared your daughter broken and unworthy before a gathering that included representatives from 12 different species. And by your own words, you severed your legal claim over her and her work. This is manipulation," the Baron snarled. "A trick devised by primitive humans who do not understand our ways." Dalyun stepped forward then, and his voice was calm, but carried clearly through the chamber. "I understand enough to know that words have power," he said. "You chose to use your daughter as a weapon to humiliate me, and now you must live with the consequences of that choice." Baron Keshin turned to the Therian officials with desperate appeal in his eyes. Surely you cannot allow these outsiders to steal from one of your own nobles. But the officials exchanged uncertain glances, and one of them finally spoke with obvious reluctance. The law is clear. Baron, your words were spoken publicly and recorded by multiple devices. The human interpretation appears to be accurate. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as the full weight of the situation became clear. Baron Keshin had trapped himself with his own cruelty, and there was no escape. Ambassador Cho turned to address Yesio directly. For the first time, Earth's Interstellar Research Consortium would like to offer you a full research position, she said warmly. You would receive complete credit for your work, access to the finest laboratories and equipment in human space, and the freedom to continue your research however you see fit. Yesio finally looked up, and her eyes glistened with tears that she refused to let fall. You would do this for me? She asked in a voice that trembled with hope she had long since abandoned. We would be honored to have you, Do-hyun said. Your mind is extraordinary, and it deserves to be recognized by a galaxy that should have seen you long ago. Baron Keshin made one last attempt to regain control. Yesio, he said, softening his voice to something almost resembling warmth. Think carefully about what you are doing. These humans cannot offer you what your own people can, and you will always be a stranger among them. Yesio looked at her father, and for a moment the room held its breath. Then she spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone, including herself. For 20 years I've been a stranger in my own home, she said. These humans saw more value in me after one conversation than you have seen in my entire life. She turned her hover chair toward Ambassador Cho and lifted her chin with quiet dignity. I accept your offer. The Baron's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing he could do. His cruelty had been his own undoing, and every witness in the chamber would remember this moment. For the rest of their lives, the trade negotiations were quickly forgotten as the true prize of the meeting became clear. Earth had not come to sign unfavorable agreements. They had come to claim a mind that would change the galaxy forever. Do-hyun did not sleep that night. He sat in his quarters aboard the human delegation's transport vessel and studied the files that Yesio had transferred to his personal device. Before they parted, the more he examined her work, the more certain he became that this quiet young woman had achieved something extraordinary. While hidden away in her father's estate like a shameful secret by morning, his eyes burned from staring at equations and his mind raced with possibilities. Needed help from someone who could verify what he suspected, and he knew exactly who to ask. Ambassador Minji Cho was already awake when Do-hyun requested an urgent meeting, and she greeted him in the small conference room with a cup of tea in her hands and concern in her eyes. You look like you have not slept, she observed. I have not, Do-hyun admitted. Ambassador, I need to show you something, and I need you to keep an open mind. He placed his device on the table and projected Yesio's theoretical model onto the wall screen. Ambassador Cho studied the display with a frown that deepened as she recognized the complexity of what she was seeing. Where did this come from? She asked. From Baron Keshin's daughter, Do-hyun replied. The one he mocked last night. The one he called broken and unworthy. The ambassador's frown shifted into something harder and more focused. The girl in the hover chair developed this. She has been working on it for 7 years, Do-hyun said. Alone and unsupported, while her father kept her hidden from view like a stain on his family reputation. Ambassador Cho set down her tea and moved closer to the screen, her eyes tracing the mathematical notations with the careful attention of someone who had spent years navigating complex diplomatic documents. I am not a scientist, she said slowly, but even I can see that this is substantial work. It is more than substantial, Do-hyun said. If her calculations are correct, this model could reduce FTL fuel consumption by 40% across standard transit routes. The ambassador turned to look at him with sharp surprise. 40%. Do you understand what that would mean for interstellar commerce? I understand, Do-Yoon replied. Which is why I'm asking you to have our scientific attach review the data immediately. Ambassador Cho was silent for a long moment as she considered the implications. The negotiations with the Therians had been difficult from the start, and Earth's delegation had been forced to accept numerous concessions simply to remain at the table. But if what Do-Yoon was showing her was real, everything could change. Send the files to Dr. Yoon, she finally said. Tell him this is priority 1, and I need his assessment within the day. Do-Yoon nodded and transmitted. The data before the ambassador could change her mind. The waiting was the hardest part. He spent the morning reviewing security protocols and attending to his regular duties while his thoughts kept returning to Yeseo and the brilliance she had. Hidden from a galaxy that refused to see her, Dr. Yoon, the delegation's senior scientific officer, was a quiet man who rarely showed emotion. So when he burst into the conference room 6 hours later with wide eyes and trembling hands, Do-Yoon knew the answer before the scientist spoke a single word. This is real, Dr. Yoon said, breathlessly. I have run the calculations 4 times, and every simulation confirms the theoretical framework. This young woman has solved a problem that our best researchers have been struggling with for decades. Ambassador Cho rose from her seat with controlled urgency. You are certain. I am certain, Dr. Yoon replied. If we can implement this model, it will revolutionize FTL travel. The fuel savings alone would be worth more than the combined GDP of a dozen planetary systems. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over them. Do-Yoon felt a strange mixture of vindication and concern because he had hoped Yeseo's work would prove valuable. But he had not expected it to be worth more than entire worlds. We need to discuss how to proceed, Ambassador Cho said carefully. This discovery gives us significant leverage in the negotiations. No, Do-Yoon said firmly. Both the ambassador and Dr. Yoon turned to look at him with surprise. Sergeant Major. This could change everything for Earth's position in galactic trade, Ambassador Cho said. I understand, Do-Yoon replied. But we cannot use her work as a bargaining chip without her knowledge or consent. She trusted me with this research, and I will not betray that trust. The ambassador studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. What do you propose instead? We offer Yeseo a position with Earth's Interstellar Research Consortium, Do-Yoon said. Full credit for her work, full compensation, and a path to continue her research with the resources and support she deserves. You want to recruit her, Dr. Yoon said slowly. I want to give her a choice, Do-Yoon corrected. Her father has kept her trapped and invisible for years, and we have the power to offer her something she has never had. The freedom to be seen for who she truly is, Ambassador. Cho walked to the window and looked out at the Therian landscape beyond. Baron Keshem will not simply let us take his daughter, she said. Whatever his feelings about her condition, she is still his property under Therian law. Then we need to find a way to change that. Do-Yoon replied. The ambassador turned back with a thoughtful expression. I have been studying Therian legal code since we arrived, she said slowly. There may be a path, but it will require careful handling. What kind of path? Do-Yoon asked. Therian law grants family heads authority over their dependents in most matters, the ambassador explained. But there are exceptions for those who have been formally disowned or declared unworthy of the family name. Understanding dawned in Do-Yoon's mind like a sunrise breaking over the horizon. The Baron's speech last night, he said. He called Yeseo broken and unworthy in front of witnesses. Exactly, Ambassador Cho nodded. If we can demonstrate that his public statements constituted a legal declaration of unworthiness, then Yasio would be free from his authority and free to accept our offer. Do-hyun finished. The pieces were falling into place. But there was still one crucial step remaining. They needed to speak with Yasio herself. I will arrange a meeting, Ambassador Cho said. Officially, it will be to discuss final terms of the trade agreement. But I will request that the Baron's daughter be present. He will think we are being sentimental. Do-hyun observed the ambassador smiled. And there was steel beneath the warmth. Let him think whatever he wants. By the time he understands what is really happening, it will be too late. Do-hyun nodded and allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The Baron had thrown his daughter at him as an insult. A weapon meant to humiliate and diminish. He had no idea that his cruelty had handed Do-hyun the key to everything the morrow would bring the reckoning. And the galaxy would finally see what had been hidden in plain sight all along. Yasio did not know what to make of the human who sat beside her with such calm confidence, as if her corner of shame was simply another place to rest. She had spent years learning to recognize the patterns of those who approached her, and they always fell into the same categories. There were those who came with pity dripping from their voices like honey that was actually poison, and there were those who came seeking favor from her father by pretending kindness toward his defective daughter. And there were those who simply wanted to stare at the broken thing that the great Baron Keshin had somehow produced. But this human fit none of those patterns. He looked at her tablet with genuine interest. And when he spoke about gravitational lensing, his words carried the weight of actual understanding. You really do know what this means, Yasio said slowly, still holding the tablet close to her chest. Enough to know that what you have there is not casual study, Do-hyun replied. That looks like original theoretical work, unless I am completely mistaken. You are attempting to solve the efficiency problem in FDL transit calculations. Yasio felt something shift inside her chest, and it took her a moment to recognize the feeling, because it had been so long since she experienced it. It was hope. No one has ever noticed, she whispered. They look at my chair and they see nothing else. Do-hyun leaned back slightly and crossed his arms in a relaxed posture that somehow made the space around them feel safer. Tell me about your work, he said. And it was not a request made from politeness, but a genuine invitation. For a moment, Yasio hesitated because she had kept her research secret for so long that sharing it felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was ground below. But something about these humans' steady gaze made her want to take that step. My condition affects my motor neurons, she began, and her voice grew stronger as she spoke. The signals from my brain do not reach my muscles properly, which is why I cannot walk or perform most physical tasks without assistance. But my mind is untouched. She paused to see if he would offer the usual sympathetic words that meant nothing. But Do-hyun simply nodded and waited for her to continue. When I was young, my father tried every treatment available, but nothing worked. And eventually, he stopped trying and started hiding me instead. The bitterness in her voice was old and deep, like a wound that had scarred over, but never truly healed. I had nothing but time. Yasio continued. So I began to study. And I discovered that I loved mathematics and physics, and the way the universe revealed its secrets to those patient enough to look. How long have you been working on this? Do-hyun asked, nodding toward the tablet. 7 years, Yasio said. I started by learning everything I could about astrophysics, and then moved into FDL theory and xenolinguistics. And 3 years ago, I began developing my own theoretical models. She finally lowered the tablet and turned it so Do-hyun could see the screen more clearly. The current FTL systems waste enormous amounts of energy because they calculate transit paths using outdated gravitational models. And I believe I have found a way to improve the efficiency by accounting for quantum fluctuations in subspace. Density. Do-hyun studied the equations on the screen with focused attention. And Yeseo watched his face for any sign of confusion or dismissal. Instead, she saw his eyebrows rise slightly in what appeared to be surprise. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "Have you submitted this to the Galactic Cartography Institute for review?" Yeseo laughed. But it was a sound without joy. "My dream has always been to work with the Institute," she said. "They are the most respected scientific body in the Alliance, and their researchers have access to resources I could never obtain on my own." "Then why have you not applied?" Do-hyun asked. "Because applications to the Institute require sponsorship from a recognized authority. And for someone of my species, that means family sponsorship." She glanced across the hall to where her father stood surrounded by admirers who laughed at his every word. "My father would never sponsor me," Yeseo said. "A daughter who cannot walk is embarrassment enough. But a daughter who pursues academics instead of accepting her place in the shadows would bring even greater shame to his precious reputation." The words came out flat and tired because she had long ago exhausted her anger over this particular injustice. "He would rather I remain invisible forever than admit that I might be worth something." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was gentle but firm. "Where I come from, there is a saying that the only true disability is a closed mind." Yeseo looked at him with uncertainty because no one had ever spoken to her this way. "I grew up in a small town where people told me I would never amount to anything," Do-hyun continued. "They said I was too quiet and too strange and too focused on things that did not matter. But I learned that the opinions of small-minded people are chains only if you accept them. It is different for you," Yeseo said softly. "You can walk away from those who doubt you." "Can I?" Do-hyun asked. "Or did I simply learn to carry them with me until they became weightless?" Before Yeseo could respond, a servant approached and informed them that the evening was growing late and guests would soon be departing. The interruption felt like a door slamming shut, and Yeseo felt panic rising in her chest at the thought of returning to her isolation. "Wait," she said quickly, and her fingers moved across the tablet with practiced speed. "Before you go, I want to show you something I have never shown anyone." She pulled up a file that had been hidden behind layers of encryption, and the screen filled with a complex diagram that made Do-hyun lean forward with obvious interest. "This is my main theoretical model," Yeseo explained. "If I am correct, implementing this approach could reduce FTL fuel consumption by nearly 40% across all standard transit routes." Do-hyun stared at the screen in silence for several long seconds. "Do you understand what you have here?" he finally asked. "I think so," Yeseo replied uncertainly, "but I have never been able to verify my calculations with real-world data, and I do not know if my theory would survive peer review." Do-hyun looked up from the tablet and met her eyes directly. "Yeseo, if this model works the way you describe, you are not holding a research project. You are holding something that could reshape interstellar commerce across the entire galaxy." The words hit her like a wave, and she did not know whether to feel excited or terrified across the hall. Baron Keshin watched the intense conversation between his worthless daughter and the human soldier with growing irritation. His aide approached and whispered something about the trade negotiations, but the Baron barely listened because he was too busy wondering what could possibly be so interesting about a broken girl and her useless hobbies. He had no idea that the answer to that question would soon destroy everything he had built. The grand hall of Baron Vorath, Keshin's estate, stretched wide like the mouth of some great beast waiting to swallow everyone inside. And Sergeant Major Do-hyun Park stood near the entrance with his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the alien nobles move through the crowd like sharks through still water. The Therians were tall and elegant with blue-gray skin that seemed to shimmer under the floating lights above. and they carried themselves with the kind of pride that came from centuries of believing themselves better than everyone else in the galaxy. Dohyun had seen this kind of arrogance before, but never quite so thick in the air. He was part of Earth's diplomatic delegation, assigned as military attaché and security officer for Ambassador Minji Cho, who stood across the room speaking with several trade representatives from the Galactic Commerce Alliance. The negotiations had lasted 3 difficult days, and tonight was supposed to be the final gathering before the agreements were signed, but Dohyun could feel the tension beneath the polite smiles and formal greetings. The Therians had made it clear from the start that they considered humans to be newcomers who had not yet earned their place among the civilized species of the galaxy. Every conversation came with a subtle reminder that Earth was young and inexperienced and perhaps not ready for the responsibilities of interstellar trade. Dohyun let the insults slide off him like rain from stone, because he had learned long ago that reacting to provocation only gave power to those who sought to hurt you. Baron Vorath Keshin was the worst of them all. He was the host of this gathering and one of the wealthiest nobles on the Therian homeworld, and he moved through his guests like a king surveying his subjects. His robes were made of some fabric that shifted colors as he walked, and jewels hung from his long fingers like drops of frozen light. When he laughed, which was often, the sound was sharp and cold. The Baron had spent much of the evening making comments about human limitations. He spoke loudly about how humans needed artificial gravity because their bodies were too weak to adapt, and how humans required so much sleep that they wasted nearly a third of their short lives unconscious. His guests laughed at every joke, and the human delegation endured it all with diplomatic patience. Dohyun watched from his position near the wall and said nothing. He had served in conflicts on 3 different worlds before being assigned to diplomatic duty, and he had learned that silence was often the most powerful weapon a person could carry. The Baron noticed him eventually. Perhaps it was the stillness that drew attention, or perhaps the Baron simply needed a new target for his entertainment. Either way, he crossed the hall with a glass of something purple in his hand and stopped directly in front of Dohyun with a smile that held no warmth. "The human soldier," the Baron said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, standing so quietly in the corner like a decoration that forgot its purpose. Dohyun met the Baron's eyes and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but offered no other response. The Baron's smile flickered with annoyance at the lack of reaction. "Tell me," the Baron continued, "do they teach you to be so silent on your world? Or is this simply the limit of human conversation skills? I find that listening often teaches more than speaking." Dohyun replied calmly. Several Therian nobles nearby exchanged glances at the response, and the Baron's eyes narrowed slightly before his smile returned wider than before. How philosophical for a species that still measures its civilization in mere centuries, the Baron said, and then he turned to address the growing crowd around them. "You know, I have always admired how humans embrace their charitable nature despite their many shortcomings." Dohyun remained still and waited because he could sense that something worse was coming. The Baron gestured across the hall toward a corner that Dohyun had noticed earlier but deliberately avoided. Studying too closely in that corner, separated from the rest of the guests by an invisible wall of social rejection, sat a young Therian female in a hover chair. She had the same blue-gray skin as the others, but where the other Therians moved with fluid grace, she remained motionless except for her hands, which worked at a tablet in her lap. No one spoke to her, and no one looked at her, and she seemed to exist in a bubble of isolation even in this crowded room. "That is my daughter, Yesio," the Baron announced, and his voice carried the weight of deliberate cruelty. "She was born with a defect in her neural pathways that prevents her body from functioning as it should. And despite the finest medical attention that wealth can provide, she remains as you see her now. The crowd fell silent, and even those who had been laughing at the Baron's earlier jokes looked uncomfortable. Since humans are so famous for their charity, the Baron continued with poison dripping from every word. Perhaps our sergeant would like to keep my broken daughter company for the evening, since neither of them truly belongs among the worthy. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Ambassador Cho stepped forward with anger flashing in her eyes. But Do-hyun raised a hand slightly to stop her. He looked at the Baron for a long moment, and then he simply nodded. "It would be my honor," Do-hyun said quietly. He turned and walked across the hall toward the young woman in the hoverchair, leaving the Baron standing with a confused expression that quickly turned to satisfaction as he assumed his insult had achieved its purpose. Ezio looked up as Do-hyun approached, and her eyes held a mixture of suspicion and resignation that spoke of years spent receiving unwanted attention from those who pitied her or wished to use her for their own purposes. She was younger than Do-hyun had expected, perhaps equivalent to a human in her early 20s, and her face was sharp with intelligence despite the wariness in her expression. "May I sit with you?" Do-hyun asked, gesturing to an empty seat beside her. "You do not have to do this," Ezio replied, and her voice was soft but steady. "My father's gains are his own, and you owe me nothing." "I know," Do-hyun said as he sat down, "but I have been standing for hours, and this seems like the most interesting corner of the room." Ezio blinked at him, clearly uncertain how to respond to someone who was not treating her with pity or awkwardness. Her fingers had stopped moving on the tablet in her lap, and Do-hyun let his eyes drift to the screen without making it obvious that he was looking. What he saw made him pause. The tablet was covered in mathematical notations and star charts, but these were not simple calculations or casual studies. The equations were complex gravitational formulas, and the chart showed FTL trajectory patterns with optimization markers that Do-hyun had only seen in advanced military navigation systems. Was not the work of someone passing time. This was serious theoretical research. That is an interesting approach to gravitational lensing compensation, Do-hyun said casually. Ezio's eyes went wide, and she pulled the tablet slightly closer to her chest as if protecting a secret. "You understand what this is?" she asked, and for the first time her voice held something other than resignation. "I was a combat medic before I transferred to diplomatic security," Do-hyun said, "but I spent 2 years on a deep space patrol vessel, and I learned enough about navigation theory to recognize brilliance when I see it." Ezio stared at him as if he had suddenly started speaking a language she thought no one else knew across the hall. Baron Kashin watched the conversation with growing irritation because his insult was supposed to humiliate the human, not give his worthless daughter someone to talk to. But Do-hyun did not notice the Baron's glare because for the first time that evening he had found something genuinely interesting, and it was sitting right in front of him, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be seen.